Companies were not
wanting
to invest in full-time employees, so looking at how can they more effectively use.
So I did do a little bit of research, and I was
people and bring those special skills as
and how
they
you
need
thrive in this.
Where does this come from? Where does it start?
Welcome to Crosstalk, our regular show where we dive behind the headlines and into the hype. In this first season, we continue to explore the changing relationship between the employer and the employee. With me today upon the high seas, Captain Nicola Matson.
Ahoy there, sailor.
Commodore Luke Talbot.
Aye, Captain.
Vice Admiral Julie Brophy.
Oh, hoist the mainsail.
And myself, the boss, Commander-in-Chief Martin Rover Parks. In this episode, we're going to talk about organisational structure and teams. So without a moment to spare, is your rudder stuck? You've got the right crew, so why aren't you on course? Let's drop the anchor and tackle 3 big fish.
I feel like I should have worn my blue and white striped top for this one. Okay, so in today's Crosstalk, we're going to be talking about 3 things. The first is there's a lot of talk about flattening organisations, but is flatter better? And actually, what do we mean by flatter? Is a lack of teamwork sinking you faster than a lack of talent? Can you build the culture and behaviours you need for success? And finally, how do you empower people to be more innovative and agile, deliver impact and trump the competition?
Fantastic. We've got our course set, the compass bearings. Let's get sailing.
Wow, okay, all right, sailor. I think that's enough maritime puns for one day. As usual on Crosstalk, this is kind of a big deal. I've actually really been looking forward to this one. We started with the gig economy in the first Crosstalk, then millennials, but now we're tackling the genuine foundations of organisations, the organisational structure. According to Deloitte Human Capital Trends 2016, they got respondents from 7,000 companies across 130 countries. And the number one issue on people's minds, actually 92% of respondents' minds to be precise, was how to redesign our organisational structure to meet the demands of the workforce and climate today. In short, their conclusion was that today's digital world of work has shaken the very foundation of the org structure, which is now shifted for many from functional hierarchy to one that Deloitte refers to as a network of teams.
Yeah, and actually in the same study, and something that was quite surprising to me, was that only 24% of those companies, the large companies, that's anything over 50,000 headcount, and only 38% of all companies that responded to that study actually operate today with a traditional functional hierarchy. So that really supports this concept or idea that organisations are really starting to look to, or actually already have transformed their organisation. And that was a lot higher than I was expecting to see, actually.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, stop, time out. Functional hierarchy, network of teams. I also know of holacracy and flat structures. But what the heck do all of these mean? For me, when people talk of hierarchy, I don't think of the world of work. I think of my father in the military. There you have a clear hierarchy, a clear chain of command. Within that chain of command, you have squads, and those squads within them have a hierarchy, but they have the flexibility to do whatever they need to do to complete the task, or in this example, the mission.
That's really interesting that you talk about the military there, Martin, because they were actually one of the very early adopters of the term hierarchy. Although the first time it's really cited is in about the 1880s in the Oxford English Dictionary. And really what it's describing is the way that we organise a group of people to deliver the work. So in the old traditional hierarchies, you had lots of levels. It was a very command structure. So there were lots of levels, and it was very clear about who was in charge. That's one end of the continuum. At the other end of the continuum, you have now very flat organisations. We literally have no levels, no job levels, and no seniority. And those are the two kind of extremes. What you have in the middle is something like a mix of those. So you have flatter organisations, which are more structured around the traditional hierarchy, but instead of having maybe 15, 16 levels, they've actually got 4 or 5. So it's very much flatter. And then you have flatterchies.
Flatarchies.
I'm never going to get that term. Flatarchies, which are a bit of a hybrid approach where you can have flat teams that are sort of in an organisational hierarchy, or you can have a very flat organisation where you have some hierarchies in the team. So those are really the sort of options that are available now.
Yeah, and really interestingly for the flatter keys, and actually don't worry about the pronunciation too much because it is an entirely made up word, so it doesn't really matter. But for the flatter keys, they can actually emerge from both ends of that spectrum, from both extremes. So they can actually come from a traditional functional hierarchy organisation where you can find cross-functional teams where there is no structure within them, so there's no hierarchy within them. And they can emerge from entirely flat organisations, as you said, where within them you can have a cross-functional team that does have an actual distinct hierarchy that's needed to complete the task.
Yeah, what's interesting and what I found a little bit confusing sort of reading all of these terms and definitions is the first example that you gave of the flatarchy. To me, sounds very similar to, and if you think flatarchy is hard, try saying holacracy. But it sounds to me very much like a holacratic structure, because that talks about slightly different terminology. They talk about circles, but which in effect are teams that don't have hierarchies, but those circles themselves sit within a hierarchical structure. So to me, that seems very similar to that sort of hybrid flatarchy. So is it the case actually that holacracy, network of teams, team of teams, flatarchies, there seems to be quite a lot of overlap between those?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of similarities between those, the way that you organise people, so yeah.
Okay.
And actually I heard someone talking about organisational hierarchies historically reflecting the way that society was set up during feudal times, which I thought was quite interesting. So if you think about that, the concept of the king or queen, then you've got that sort of layer of lords, and then you've got the sort of peasants or serfs, doing all of the work, tilling the land and so on. Yeah,
actually, for those of you who aren't lucky enough to live under a monarchy such as ours in the United Kingdom, you might want a more close to home example of what this feels like. So this actually might translate to actually how families work, where there is traditionally there is definitely a functional hierarchy within the family unit, and actually the most extreme, wide, large-scale example of this might be the mafia.
Yeah, but if that is the case, and if organisational structures have reflected those societal structures, then they haven't changed or adopted with the same speed. So we know time has changed. We don't live in feudal times.
Thank
we
goodness.
Don't live with sort of patriarchies or matriarchies in most parts of the world, and that's because we've got more equality, we've got more autonomy, and those sort of rigid structures maybe haven't become totally obsolete, but they're certainly less applicable or relevant in today's society. And yet it seems like organisations are taking a lot longer time, are much slower to adopt and change.
Definitely. Now, if the Queen Elizabeth is happening to listen to this crosstalk, which I'm sure she is, hi Lizzie.
Subscribe to the podcast.
Do subscribe. For now, that's much clearer. For me, the fog's lifted. But what's better? Is flatter better than traditional functional hierarchies?
Well, actually, just to sort of butt in there slightly, and we can get back to that, but I think before we talk about is flatter better, it's probably worth at least spending a little bit of time considering the main drivers behind this movement away from the traditional functional hierarchies. And we talked in the last crosstalk around millennials and about these sort of demographic changes that we're seeing that are really starting to impact organisations. So we've got a workforce with millennials and also Gen Ys joining. We know that they're breaking down silos and boundaries and are really looking to work in a way that the traditional hierarchy doesn't really support. But we're also seeing people work till later in life. I hope that isn't me, but it's not uncommon to see people working beyond the age of 70.
You're already in later life, aren't you?
Watch it, Martin.
Wowzers.
So
for everyone listening, please refer to the previous crosstalk on millennials.
So we've got both a young and an older workforce, and then there's also globalisation and the rise of the gig economy. Also a previous crocktalk.
Crocktalk. Entirely different subject matter.
So the workforce is getting more diverse, it's more dispersed, and all of this is changing what is sometimes referred to as the sort of social contract between an employee and their employer. So gone are the days when we can expect to have a career where we move up the ladder or the hierarchy of an organisation, and yet businesses still need to keep work interesting and engaging if they want to attract and retain top talent.
Yeah.
And I think finally another driver has really been this rate of change, which is really accelerating. And I don't just mean in terms of technological innovation, although I think that's where we tend to focus, but just the rate of change in business in general. But if we do look specifically at things like digitalisation and advancements in technology, everybody sort of cites the Ubers and the Airbnbs and how they've really caused businesses to have to reposition themselves. But you can actually go back quite a bit further and think about companies like Blockbusters, that were pretty much put out of business by the likes of Netflix and Amazon.
You don't know what Blockbuster is?
No.
Okay, well, I think that's probably because it was about 15 years BA.
What's BA?
Before avocado.
Oh.
Anyway.
They delivered things called VHS cassettes, Martin, which maybe I can explain to you after the crosstalk.
And I won't be explaining Netflix and chill after this crosstalk.
There definitely was never a thing called Blockbuster and chill.
That you're aware of. But anyway, so all of these things are really sort of driving this need to change and for organisational structures to better allow businesses to adapt, to respond more quickly to competition, to market demands, and really basically survive in this era of hyper competition.
Yeah, I think one of the things you're talking about that and how they need to respond. I mean, one of the big advantages of a flatter organisation is that decisions don't take quite so long. So you've got a smaller hierarchy for the decisions to go up or questions to go up and for the decisions to come back down. And also with that flatter organisation, you tend to do away with the information silos, so people have the information they need to be more innovative, to be more agile, to actually meet the needs of their customers and the organisation. I think one of the other things as well that you referred to slightly earlier, Nicola, is key, is about the kind of image that you're giving as an organisation. So we know we want to attract millennials and Generation Z, but they don't want to work in they don't want to work in hierarchical organisations, but it can take them a long time to get those opportunities to really grow and develop.
I actually had a really great example of that, because I often wondered, is it really such a big deal for millennials? Because I don't know, because I'm not one, unfortunately. But I was at a conference last year and there was a lady doing a talk from a bank, and I won't name the bank, but she gave this very real example of a young lady that was coming in to interview with the bank, and she went into reception. They gave her a special key that took her to the 12th floor in the lift that you could only get to with the special key. The doors opened, all oak panelling, plush carpets, and a butler, I'm not joking, a butler asked her what she'd like to have a drink before the interview. So she took her tea or coffee, don't know which, and went into the interview, sat down and said, I'd just like you to know that I have absolutely no interest in working for an organisation where the chiefs are all in the top floor with the butler and the rest of the company, they're actually doing the work on the lower levels. So thank you, but no thank you.
Hell yeah, and I think we can all identify with that. I mean, you can't even move around here for all the butlers. Anyway,
you do know that's not my job title, don't you?
Not yours.
Oh, it's mine.
Can I bring you another glass of water, sir?
Anytime. So joking aside, I think we'd all agree that actually flatter has some very strong advantages. So that's flatter. But what about the extreme? So the extreme is totally flat, no boss.
No boss. That sounds good.
Wait, what?
Okay, for those joining Crosstalk for the first time, Luke is actually Martin's boss.
Yeah, I am, exactly. So basically, no, seniority does seem a little bit idealistic, a little bit like Marxism, possibly if we're going to get a little bit political, maybe communism. But there is an example of where this seems to have worked really, really well, and I mean exceptionally well. And that's a Finnish company called Supercell. For those of you who don't know Supercell, they make video games for mobile devices. They're very famous for two games in particular, games like Clash of Clans and Clash Royale. If you've never played their games, you've almost certainly seen their adverts. And they are hugely successful. Their CEO, Ilkka Pananen, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, puts this down to actually having no structure whatsoever. So he actually personally interviews everybody who joins the company. They have an entirely flat structure. They were acquired for $8.6 billion, which is a huge amount. So they haven't probably been working for very long, because mobile app games haven't been working for very long. And their most popular game was actually just built by a small group of people. So 5 people are responsible for actually making Clash of Clans of the entire company, which is quite impressive.
Right. So you talk about this as a very flat organisation.
Indeed.
But actually, how many people are in the organisation?
And I can see where you're going with this. So it's a good point, and I did look into that, and there are about 200 employees in the company.
Well, actually, I thought you were going to say smaller. So I think for completely flat to work successfully at 200 is quite impressive. My personal view is that that's the exception that breaks the rule. And actually, that was sort of backed up a little bit by a podcast I was listening to with an interview with Brian Robertson, who invented holacracy. And he actually developed that sort of organisational model through a series of experimentation. So he didn't get it right first time. He tried a few different approaches. And actually one of the approaches that he took, and it was a much smaller company than Supercell, was a completely flat structure. And it completely failed. And the reasons that he gave on that interview is he said that basically sort of implicit power structures emerged and there was a lot of counterproductive politics.
Yeah.
So I suspect, apart from the exceptional cases, that if you've got an entirely flat structure, people are going to be people, and inherently there's going to be some kind of power struggle when there's no structure in place, is my thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's very interesting.
I think going back to another example actually that's often cited about flat organisations is W.L. Gore, which has about 10,000 people in it now. But if you look a bit deeper, it actually has 3 levels of hierarchy. So it's very, very flat, but it isn't completely flat. And I think that's possibly, again, because there needs to be some, in a sort of larger organisations, there needs to be some hierarchy, even though it's very, very flat.
Yeah, it would certainly appear so. So it seems they're flatter, not flat.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I get it. So it seems to make sense. It's actually funny because when I was, I read on a forum the experience of one guy in particular who worked at a so-called flat company, and he had a particularly negative experience, and he said that, okay, it was flat, but what tends to happen actually is that the guy with the biggest rises to the top.
Or the woman with the mowing help.
I don't know where you're going to go with that.
I think you're beyond help. So on that note, let's get some fresh air on deck. It's really difficult to see nowadays how a traditional functional hierarchy can work. I think that's backed up by the sheer volume of organisations that have already moved away from it.
Yeah.
So, if you disagree, I don't think anyone is disagreeing at the moment, but if you do disagree and you think traditional hierarchies tickle your pickle, then let us know. Join the debate at questback.com.
I'm still recovering a little bit from the tickle your pickle. But anyway, I also agree, so not a lot of crosstalk going on when it comes to traditional hierarchies. However, one thing that did strike me when I was reading the Deloitte study is if you consider that 62% of those companies already do not operate with a traditional functional hierarchy, and yet almost half of them said that they are currently undergoing or thinking of going through a restructure, it sort of begs the question, what is it that they're restructuring from then, if they're already not functional traditional hierarchy?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There's a slight mathematical discrepancy there, isn't there? So that would make us think that actually some people have already migrated from maybe a traditional functional hierarchy towards something else, and that hasn't worked out. They're moving towards another one of the alternatives or some other hybrid, or maybe they've been at something that they're moving towards a functional hierarchy. We don't know. It would be very interesting to know if this applies to any of you listening or watching this. So maybe you did change and it didn't work. Let us know. Join the debate at questback.com.
I want to remind the Gen Xer as well that we've got Facebook and Twitter, so do get involved there as well. Snapchat, we went through it last time.
Okay.
So, in short, if you're currently operating within a traditional hierarchy, you could be moments away from a disaster. Iceberg dead ahead. It's like Titanic, but Leo isn't there to save us. But what we've also heard is that totally flat probably won't work either.
Yeah.
Like all good things in life, maybe there's a healthy medium. There are hybrid models and flexibility in the approaches available to you.
Yeah, and I think for me, the common thread across these sort of different structures is the importance of cross-functional teams. So if we assume that teams are going to become more and more important when it comes to organisational design and structure, I think it's important to look at how we set up those teams and how we empower them to be successful. But before we do that, I'm going to ask what is probably going to seem like a bit of a stupid question. But I think historically I've used the word team in the wrong context when we're talking about teams today. So Julie, what is a team?
I'm going to start with what isn't a team. So a team isn't a group of people who just happen to work for the same hierarchical
Which is
boss.
where I've used it in the past.
Yes. What a team is, and if you go to the research of people like Hackman and Wegman, who are really big in this area, is essentially a team is a group of people who have a common purpose, have a common direction, and they need to work together to be interdependent and using their skills and knowledge to achieve that objective. So that's one key thing from them. So the interdependency is really important. Another thing they talk about is actually having the right people in that team. So that's knowledge, skills, and abilities. So you need to structure your team to achieve this joint objective. And one of the other really key things they talk about is the team size. So do you have the right number of people within your team or within your cell to actually achieve your objectives?
I actually read a great quote on that, and it said, if you can't feed your team with 2 pizzas, then your team is too big.
That sounds right. But 18-inch, 10-inch pizza?
I sort of think the size doesn't matter. They didn't factor in someone like me who can easily wolf down 2 pizzas on my own.
So Nicola, team of
Team
one.
of one, yeah.
Okay. So actually on that, and following on from what you've just said, Julie, going back to Supercell, they didn't get it right first time. So there was a lot of trial and error, and I think they admit that. There was trial and error to try to work out what the perfect cross-functional team is to get something amazing like Clash of Clans out with only 5 people. So fun fact for all you factoids out there, a cell, so Supercell, they get their name from cell, which is what they call one of these teams, and Supercell is simply the collection of cells within their organization that is taking responsibility and ownership and churning out these top-notch products.
Like it.
Yeah. So actually also coming back to something we said at the very beginning, we spoke about team behaviour, culture. Now we're talking about different organisational structures that might be more maybe modern and innovative and agile. So coming back to behaviour and culture, let's imagine a little bit that I'm the CEO of a large organisation, about 4,000 employees, and I'm moving towards this or want to move towards this, and I'm going to start setting up these individual squads or teams of people, and I want them to be successful. So one of my massive concerns right now is, how do I make sure they're not just diluting what I think the company stands for, and we're not just creating lots of little mini companies here?
Yeah, one of the things to do to actually monitor that is to do light touch feedback regularly, but a light touch, because we've actually empowered these teams. We don't want to go in heavy, but if you can just monitor how people are feeling, how the team is working, and then if you start to see issues coming out, actually either work with that team, or if you're seeing it across a number of teams, actually think about a sort of more company-wide intervention. But doing that monitoring means that you can monitor the kind of the behaviours and the culture of the organisation and make sure it reinforces what you want the business to be like. But the other advantage of doing it that way is you can also monitor other things which we know are key about high-performance organisation, like psychological safety, which is a concept which has been around since about the late 1990s from Amy Edmondson. And that's really about, do people feel safe to bring their whole self to the organisation? Do they feel safe and know that their colleagues have their back, that they can speak up if there's an issue, that they can actually try and fail things? And also to understand how the team dynamics are working. So are we working well as a team? Are we behaving towards each other as we should to reflect the culture of the organisation that we want?
Okay, that's very reassuring, and actually as a CEO I'm now quite reassured, and actually what I do believe in, actually personally, no longer role playing, I believe really strongly that organisations need a culture of transparency and trust in order to succeed. Otherwise it will just lead to a lot of frustration and job hunting among the workforce, especially nowadays. And when I think about old functional hierarchies, that is almost the antithesis of transparency and trust. The people at the bottom probably have no idea what's being done at the top of the organisation. So as I move towards my flatter with cross-functional teams that are working on these mini projects or success-oriented projects, I like that. I like the fact that now I'm monitoring all of them and actually picking up areas where, individuals within that might have the wrong behaviours and might have the wrong, sort of counterproductive attitudes towards work. Good.
Luke, I think that's an excellent point. We're going to have to throw some more coal in the boiler and get the steamship going much quicker because we're running out of time.
I thought we
here.
had sails
I
earlier.
thought we were
steamship
definitely
now?
a sailing ship earlier, but maybe this is progress.
We are a very special ship, that's for sure. I want to make sure that we cover our last topic around empowerment. Nicola, how do we empower teams to be successful?
So I think there's a couple of things that we can do as organisations, and I think probably the most important one that businesses need to do to empower teams to be successful, particularly businesses that might be newly transitioning from more of a traditional command and control model, is to set boundaries. And I realise that probably sounds really counterintuitive.
That's ironic as well, coming from you, boundary setting.
Oh, okay, that's fair. But I say that might sound slightly counterintuitive. But if you have come from an organisation where you haven't had autonomy and authority and the control to make your own decisions, to suddenly be in a position where you have them, but there's no boundaries in terms of what you can and can't do, can actually be quite daunting. It can hinder the decision-making process. So by setting those boundaries that are broad, it actually facilitates self-regulation, decision-making, and gives the team the freedom to make the decisions they need to be successful.
That does sound really good, but I'm struggling to see this in the real world. Can you give me an example, a tangible example of this?
Yeah, sure. So one example might be, let's say you've got an organisation that has a customer support team or customer success team. You might say to that group of individuals, you have the authority to spend up to 20% of the net worth of that that customer, in order to retain them. And an example of that might be, I'm not the only person here who has rang up Sky or Virgin telling them that I was going to leave because I'd seen a better deal. Because I know that the person I'm speaking to on the phone has the authority to reduce my monthly subscription.
Yeah, and I'm actually getting a note from our sponsor here. So other broadband providers are terrible also. I love that example, and also for two reasons. One, because when we talk about agility and innovation, I think people naturally start to go to product development and getting new stuff out, and we tend to forget the things that we depend on, like support and some of the jobs that are absolutely crucial to the success of an organisation. But I also love that because I have a personal example of this very recently, where a lack of empowerment was a big issue. So I have a washing machine, it broke down. It's a big issue. Like many of you, I have young children and a family, we need to clean clothes. So I ordered a spare part, decided to fix it myself, because I'm a bit of a DIY freak, and I got on very well, got the spare part, and the spare part arrived in the post already broken. So I did what anyone would do. I called up the support desk and I said, can I have a new spare part?
Tragic.
I know, right? So they sent they told me over the phone they couldn't send me a new part until they'd sent me a form. I'd filled in the form with the new spare part, sent it back to them, and then when they processed that, they would send me a new spare part.
Timely,
exactly. So I'm saying, okay, well, this process isn't optimal for me right now. Can you just, let's cross over the streams, and you send me something, I'll send you the thing back, and then I can fix this before the weekend, and next week we'll have clean clothes. I said, I'm really sorry, I can't do that. And I said to her, isn't it frustrating that you can't break this process, and you're going to end this call thinking, I just spoke to a nightmare customer, and that's not going to be a great thing for you. And I'm going to get off this call, and the first thing I'm going to do is buy another washing machine from another manufacturer. And so this is a poor employee experience for you. It's a terrible customer experience for me. And it would have so easily been fixed. If you had a level of autonomy and a bit of bandwidth to actually make the right decision here, then you would have done the right thing for both of us, and we would have all won.
So what was the outcome?
I bought a new washing machine, and it wasn't them.
I think that's a great example, and not to go off on a total tangent, but I think that's also where, capturing feedback from the people on the front line around processes that aren't working, to give that visibility to organisations so they can fix those processes, is also another way that maybe you could solve that
and
issue.
If you're interested, some of this is on Twitter.
Luke, what's your Twitter handle?
That later.
So that's one example, is those sort of boundaries. I think another really important thing is setting up leaders and managers to support the empowerment of the teams, particularly, again, if you're switching from a structure where that hasn't been the case. And a good example of this actually can be found with the sort of Scrum or Agile software methodology. So with that, you have a team of individuals that are working towards a software development, and they have a role within that team called the Scrum Master. Now, the term master might lead you to think that they're in control. That's not the case. And actually, I've seen it described as a servant leader. And that's because the Scrum Master's responsibility is purely to remove obstacles and blockers that impede the team's success. They don't in any way determine how the team goes about achieving its objectives. And managers that are responsible for these cross-functional teams need to do the same thing. They need to give the team the authority and the accountability and the self-determination to decide how they regulate that team, but they do need to make sure that they do everything in their power to remove any obstacles to success.
I think that's a really important point, because you're not just changing the organisation structure, you're actually changing the role of the manager and the leader. They need these new ways of being to support the team. So one of the other good ideas during that transition is to actually audit your leadership in terms of their strengths and weaknesses, and how ready are they to deliver this new kind of culture, this new kind of behaviour. And if they're not ready, is how can you as an organisation support them to transition to what you've wanted from them in a traditional hierarchy that isn't always most relevant now as you're going forward with these new different organisational structures.
Yeah, and I would have thought for some people that's going to be more difficult than for others. If you've worked for 25 years in that command and control environment, and suddenly you're being told to shift, I'd imagine that takes a period of readjustment. One last final point from me. So we've talked about boundaries, we've talked about sort of setting up or facilitating leaders and managers to support the empowerment of the teams. I think a final point that actually Julie raised earlier that is really critical is allowing the people in the team and the teams to fail. So if you want that team to become a high-performing team, they need to be able to make mistakes. And nothing is going to kill innovation more quickly than having people feel that they're going to be punished if they make a mistake.
I think that's a really good point that you've made there, Nicola. We've almost set our rudder free with this discussion, but I want to bring it again back to those 3 questions we wanted to address so you, our listeners, can get concrete answers. Firstly, is flatter better? I think we're pretty clear, right? That's a yes.
Absolutely. So flatter is definitely better, and I don't think there's any disagreement around the table, so not a very crosstalk. But don't panic if you actually operate with a traditional functional hierarchy today. You don't need to change the organisation overnight. There's no need to come in tomorrow morning and suddenly start moving everything around immediately, because actually what's very important is that you continue to operate, you continue to perform while you transform towards that, what might be a better model for you. But you also need to allow time for your leaders to adapt. You need to allow time for them to adapt to the structure and make sure they have the right competencies and skills and setup in order to succeed. That's absolutely vital. And remember, it is okay to fail once in a while. And actually, you've been very good company that we've already mentioned. The only guaranteed way of failing is not to try.
Excellent. Luke, just make a note of that one in my performance review. It is okay to fail.
Yeah, once.
Super. I think importantly, it looks like teams are the key to success. So thinking about teams, how can we build the culture and behaviours for success? Julie?
I think you need to get regular light touch feedback from your teams to start to identify anything that causes you an issue, and then actually deal with it quickly so the wrong behaviours and the wrong attitudes and the wrong culture doesn't become embedded in these teams.
Fantastic. And lastly, but definitely not leastly, Nicola, what can we do to empower teams to be successful?
I think if I was going to pick one thing, it would be that setting of very clear but broad boundaries that empower the teams to have the autonomy and the authority to actually decide themselves how they're going to achieve their own objectives.
Okay, awesome. So in short, teams are the key to success. Get regular feedback from them, give autonomy, authority, and set boundaries. Thank you very much for attending. Do get involved. Twitter, Facebook, drop us an email. A big thank you to our panellists, Captain Nicola Matson, Commodore Luke Talbot, Vice Admiral Julie Brophy, and myself, Commander-in-Chief Martin Rover Parks. Thank you once again, and do tune in for the next Crosstalk.